We all know there are differences between men and women when it comes to health and medical issues. But did you ever think about why that is? Sure, we have different hormones, which are certainly important, but there are differences between the sexes all the way down to the gene level that play a big role as well. Nowhere is this more evident as in the area of immunology. In fact, the recent pandemic has provided important clues as to the different ways the sexes fight disease. For example, men suffer in general more from the acute illness, but women are more likely to be victims of long COVID. We see differences in other areas as well. For example, two-thirds of people with Alzheimer's are women, yet men are more likely to suffer from Parkinson's disease. And women are more likely to experience autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and multiple sclerosis. And the crazy part is that we're only just starting to understand why that is. We're going to talk to a leading scientist about the role of sex differences in our immune systems and how this growing body of knowledge could change the way we diagnose and treat disease. We'll also talk about why there's a gender gap in what we know about women's health, why it's taken so long to address this problem, and why having women in science is so important. That's a lot to discuss, but our guest is uniquely qualified by her perspective as an executive scientist, teacher, and of course, woman. Hi, I'm Dr. Mitzi Crockover. Welcome to Beyond the Paper Gown. Today we have an extraordinary guest, Dr. Erica Ullman Sapphire, who is professor, president, and CEO of the La Jolla Institute for Immunology. Welcome, Erica.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, it's interesting. You said that it was your idea to put professor first. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that story.
Well, research is the most important thing we do. So La Jolla Institute for Immunology it's a private nonprofit research institute where our faculty are allowed to just focus completely on research, focus on discovery, focus on the immune system. They're free from committee service or grading papers or whatever, all those other things. And the most important thing I can do here is further research and be one of the faculty as I lead them. So I put professor first in my title.
When I was in college, I had a art history teacher who was adamant that the real doctors were PhDs because doctor literally means to teach.
Oh, that's right. We teach the public. We actually do teach in our laboratories. We have PhD students, we have postdoc trainees, we have undergrad students. So we work with them in the art of doing research and doing discovery and guiding them through communicating these results and discovering these results. I also have an adjunct appointment at UC San Diego, and so I do teach class over there.
Oh, okay. Well, when I first met you, you were relatively new, and I had the honor and privilege of just getting a chance to chat with you, and we started talking about sex differences in immunology. And of course, my ears perked up, and as I told you, I really wanted to geek out, and so was very excited that you agreed to come on here. So tell us a little bit about what are the sex differences in immunology and why they're so important.
Boy, this is something that's so exciting that researchers are just now uncovering. But it turns out that there are really profound differences between the immune systems of men and the immune systems of women. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One is that there's a lot of immune genes encoded on the X chromosome. Every cell in your body is either XX or XY, not just your reproductive cells. Your heart is XX or XY. Your brain is XX or XY. Your B cells and T cells are XX and XY. And so on that X chromosome, you have a lot of different genes that create the parts of your immune system and control the parts of your immune system. Females have 2 copies. So females have twice the repertoire, twice the palette to paint from. They have a greater diversity in what they can launch. Also because when we are just 100 cells big in our development from fertilized egg into baby, each cell randomly turns one of those X chromosomes into an activated basal body. And so some of your cells express dads and some of your cells express moms. We are what's called mosaic. And the best image of what that looks like is a calico cat. Calico cats are only female because the genes that control coat color are on the X chromosome. And a cat becomes calico instead of solid orange or solid brown when it has a orange X chromosome and a brown X chromosome. And when that cat is 100 cells big, a section of it develops from dad's gene and a section of it develops from mom's gene. So if you could see that in my body, in your body, a calico cat section of me is making my mother's X chromosome, and another calico cat section of me is making my father's X chromosome. So the immune responses we launch are a broader mix. And the other thing is that it's not just whether that chromosome is on or off, but we have all these controls over genes. And the immune genes launched by a female can be a very different pattern from those launched by a male. And whether those genes are on or off at different levels are controlled by hormones. And estrogens are in general immune activating, and testosterones, androgens, are in general immune suppressing.
Okay, that was a lot of information, but you've explained it so beautifully, and that's really fascinating. So let me see if I understand correctly. That when you have an X chromosome from a male and an X chromosome from a female, they're in some ways different. Is that a fair statement?
It's just that you have two different copies. You've inherited variety 1 and variety 2. And so you have both blue paint and red paint to make your picture from. If the cell is XY, it only has the red paint. It only has one kind of gene. Females have twice the range. It doesn't really matter whether that X came from dad or X came from mom. It's just you're encoding twice as many possibilities.
Gotcha. Okay, and then the idea that estrogen is activating and testosterone is deactivating is fascinating. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but it makes me wonder about when you have individuals, for example, who are transitioning from one gender to another. That must open up a whole other realm of possibility.
It must. And I'm really interested in this because those are in a cis woman, you have the XX genes and you have the feminine estrogen hormonal dominance. Somebody transitioning, you could separate what are the chromosomes encoding versus what is the hormonal control of that information. So it's like there's a car and there's a driver, and you can switch the driver, switch the car. And so it's going to be really interesting to study people in transition and see how their health might change or their disease susceptibilities might change.
One of the areas that one of the scientists at the La Jolla Institute for Immunology, Dr. Sonia Sharma, has been focused on is the role of inflammation in heart disease, the number one killer of both men and women. Inflammation is basically an immune response, and it appears that there are differences between the sexes and how inflammation affects the way heart disease progresses. So talk a little bit about the impact of our genes on cardiovascular disease with respect to inflammation.
It's more important than you might think. So we know that the immune system has a role in infectious disease, right? Your immune system clears your cold. Your immune system responds to a vaccine and prevents you from getting measles. What is less well understood so far by the public, but what is now incredibly apparent in the new research is how the immune system plays a critical underlying curative and sometimes causative role in nearly every human disease, including heart disease, neurodegenerative disease, cognitive decline, autoimmunity. And the role of the immune system in heart disease is becoming more and more apparent. The interaction of the immune cells with the plaques, the susceptibility of different people into whether heart disease progresses or doesn't progress. And there's a couple of interesting things there. Some of the studies from La Jolla Institute find that if you're able to prime an immune response against heart disease, they can with a vaccine limit plaque size in your arteries. Now, that's in mice. There's some work to do to make it in human, but what an opportunity, a vaccine
Sure.
against heart disease. But what Dr. Sharma actually did for heart disease was something really interesting, looking at the sex differences. So we grew up thinking blood was blood. And if you just look at all the blood samples from different people pooled together, you might not notice some things. But when Dr. Sharma separated the blood samples from males from the blood samples from females, and then within the two sexes, who was progressing in heart disease and who was protected from heart disease, she could find little molecules called metabolites. These are little molecules we make from the food we eat, cellular processes, that are present in females that are protected from heart disease. They're not present in females with advancing heart disease, and they're not present in males at all. Had she mixed all the blood samples together and not thought to separate them by biological sex, she wouldn't have found this. But because she found this, all right, that's a clue. This thing is only in the protected females. Does that mean that it itself is a protective molecule? If so, can we turn it into a supplement for everybody, male and female? Or is this linked to protection because it points to some pathway we need to study? If we study that pathway, we're going to find the answer for why heart disease can be arrested or slowed, or what makes it accelerate. So it's a source of information that you can keep mining to bring about better human health for both sexes.
Now, you said that the individuals with advanced heart disease did not have that metabolite?
That's right. So this molecule was only present in the females that were protected. And had she mixed the samples together and just said, males and females as one population, who's protected, what's not protected, she might not have seen it.
Going back to your example of the metabolites in cardiac disease, was there any role of estrogen in those individuals that were protected versus those with advanced?
So I think you've hit on some of the next steps in the study. What are these metabolites linked to? And are these the result of some biochemical process that's activated by estrogens or not? Maybe, there are differences between males and females. If the females made this molecule and the males didn't make the molecule, then there's a real good chance that had something to do with different hormonal control of gene activation.
I want to go back to just the basic discussion about the immune system being different in men and women, because, as you well know, women tend to get more of certain autoimmune diseases than men. We know that 2/3 of people with Alzheimer's are women. And you alluded to the fact that there could be an inflammatory or immunologic response. Let's parse that out a little bit.
Yeah. The probably overly simple way of thinking about it is that an immunologic response is the good thing. If you're infected with COVID, your immune system clears it, and we want that. And that's an immunologic response. If it keeps on going and it becomes long COVID, that's an inflammatory response. The inflammatory response can create the symptoms of pain, of stiffness. They're not comfortable symptoms. Your immune system is trying to accomplish something with that stiffness and with that fever and with that pain. So it's a response that you want because your immune system must clear a pathogen, clear a cancer cell. But persistent inflammation that causes discomfort or chronic symptoms like long-term Lyme or long COVID or persistent pain and soreness are not good.
Right. And, again, when we talk about, again, some of the immunologic diseases, we call them autoimmune because it's seeing something in our body that inflammation response or immunologic response is fighting. So are you saying that maybe long COVID is almost like an autoimmune response?
It's not entirely clear yet what all long COVID is. There's certainly a lot to discover. But it does seem like a persistent inflammatory response. And it does seem to be that females are more likely to get long COVID. Males are more likely to get severe initial, what's called acute COVID. The more powerful inflammatory response of a female is better at clearing an infectious disease from the get-go. So women are more likely to survive. Women are more likely to be well instead of sick for many different viral infections, whether it's hepatitis B, HIV, a number of them. Females will control the amount of replicating virus better. So there's a term called the viral load. That's the number of replicating viral particles in the blood. And females will often have half the viral load of males. So what resonates in all our households, or when the flu comes around, has ever been a scenario where dad's laid up in bed, but mom is up and soldiering on and making soup for everybody? I think all of your listeners have seen this before, and it's been called man flu in the popular literature. And the thought was, well, they're being babies because we're dealing with it. But actually, the men are genuinely sicker. The stronger immune or inflammatory response of the female has controlled that virus in a way that the man hasn't. So females are more likely to survive the initial bout of it, but females can be more likely to get that long-term chronic disease.
Interesting. You also mentioned not only long COVID, but hepatitis B and Lyme disease. And I would also throw in something called fibromyalgia.
Yes.
When I was in medical school, in the textbook, it was called the empty nest syndrome. And because supposedly it was women more likely in their 40s or plus, when their kids had gone off to, college, they were left alone, they were depressed, they were achy, they were tired, and that was basically assuming that it was all psychologic. Well, in my practice, I can tell you that didn't really hold true, and that it was a very real, very physical kind of debilitating disease. And I understand that we may have some more information about that, much more than we did when I first started out.
Yeah, that's a growing body of research. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head there about why it is that we don't know enough about autoimmune disease. And females do get autoimmune disease at a greater level than males. And it depends on the disease. It might be 1.5 to 1. It might be, I think for rheumatoid arthritis, it's 2 to 1 or 2.5 to 1, female to male. For lupus, it's 9 to 1, female to male. It's really quite astounding. And with a lot of these autoimmune diseases, it has been difficult to diagnose exactly what's wrong. Part of it may be...
There's no test. I mean, for fibromyalgia, there weren't any what we call biomarkers. At least for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, you could do a test and something would light up.
That's right. And in the absence of diagnostics, it's hard for a clinician to say exactly what it is. And I think there's a societal thing there. I think that there has been this view of man is standard and female is aberrant. And if these weird people with their confusing hormonal cycles have something, it must be wrong. It's in their head. I mean, there's a reason why, the Greek root hist is both hysterical and hysterectomy, right? It's this inappropriate perception of, these women are just, it's in their head. They're depressed, and they're not. They're genuinely sick until enough clinicians and researchers pay attention to there's something really wrong here and get to the bottom of it, so we can find real markers and we can understand the mechanism and we can put some kind of treatments in place that would slow progression or try to reverse symptoms. And there's clues that it might be possible. So patients with rheumatoid arthritis that get pregnant, their symptoms go away while they're pregnant, and then they come back sometime after giving birth. Okay, that means some switches were flipped. It turned off, turned back on. Okay, we just have to figure out what are those switches, what got flipped, so we can do that for all people, male, female, pregnant, not pregnant.
And it's the opposite for lupus.
Yeah, exactly. So there's many autoimmune diseases, not just one thing. And the shame is a lot of these diseases strike women in their prime of life, women in their prime working years and prime caring years. And so when you talk about the cost to society of her working ability and her caring ability, it's tremendous. It's a tremendous cost to society of the unappreciated importance and need for research in women's health.
Great segue, because you alluded to the fact that, most of the research had been done on men, and it wasn't until 1994 that the NIH mandated that women and underrepresented people should be included in those trials if they were going to get funding. And so I'd love to understand what your view in terms of what you've seen in terms of changes, but also maybe comment on the fact that even though perhaps we've made strides there, we're still doing animal studies with male mice.
Exactly. Right. So if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten. And historically, clinical research was done on male subjects, and that was often for the best of intentions. They don't want to, inadvertently treat some woman who didn't know she was pregnant and cause a birth defect.
Sure.
But that meant you didn't have the data and how something worked in females. And so it turns out there are really important differences. 8 out of 10 of the drugs most recently pulled off the market for unfortunate side effects had those unfortunate side effects in females. This is also true not just in the female humans, but in the female research mice, right? It might, and there are a couple of reasons why researchers used to always use the male mice. Maybe they wanted to hold the female mice back for breeding. Often the reason was because the females would have different responses to the disease model or the drug at different times of the month. And it was thought, well, that's just too complicated. Yeah, you know what? It's important.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Welcome to our lives.
51% of the population. You can't say 51% of the population is too complicated and therefore we should ignore it. The answer is you do more research.
There you go.
And it's shocking to people when they realize that it wasn't until 1994 that you had to account for using equal numbers of males and females. Of course, if you're doing treatments for testicular cancer, you only work on males.
Sure.
But in a study for something like heart disease, that's a killer of both, you need to use both. And it was only, I think, in 2015, and that wasn't very long ago, the concept of sex as a biological variable in how disease manifests and how you might treat disease became important. And only in the last couple of years are researchers required to account for whether they're using equal numbers of male and female mice, and even whether the cells in their tissue culture dish are male or female. Nobody thought about it before. But it's a fundamental underlying thing. Once the researchers started realizing their tremendous differences, it's a source of information that was just simply previously overlooked.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I wonder if you feel that there's a coincidence between what you just described and the fact that we now have more women going into research and more women going into medicine.
So you have to choose what research question you're going to ask. And people can't help but come at it from their own perspective. And it is true that women may be more interested in women's health than most men. And if the people determining what research got funded were mostly men, or the heads of institutes directing what would be done were mostly men, or the heads of laboratories, nobody thought about it. People may not have thought about the effect of different health policies and research outcomes on different races unless different races were at the table to bring the topic up and ask the question. And I think that awareness is really, really important. People are usually stunned when they start to hear the numbers. Females are 51% of the population. We're more than 50% of the workforce. We control 60% of the wealth. We control 80% of the healthcare decisions. We make 85% of the consumer spending decisions. Why is there not equal representation in research and in research topics? It becomes a set of blinders that winds up compromising the health of women at a tremendous economic cost to the nation.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll talk more about how increasing the number of women in science and leadership improves everyone's health, and why voting makes a difference in research on women's health. Hi, I'm Dr. Mitzi Crockover, host of the podcast Beyond the Paper Gown, part of the Off-Script Health Network. The midterm elections are right around the corner, and much is at stake in this election, especially for women's health. Yes, abortion is on the ballot, but so is access to other types of care that women need, the kind of research that will be funded, and which innovations will be made available to help us be healthy and well. Policy decisions like these are made by the candidates we elect. Join us on October 26th for a webinar we're calling Putting Women's Health on the Ballot. We'll be talking to experts about how women's health is affected by these policy decisions and how you can make your voice heard, both at the ballot and after the election. You won't want to miss this. You can find more information at beyondthepapergown.com. I hope to see you there. Hi, we're here with Dr. Erica Ullman-Sapphire of the La Jolla Institute for Immunology. Before the break, we were talking about the impact of having more women in science. I wonder what you're seeing in terms of more opportunities, or do we still have the same barriers to having women in the research workforce, if you will? And I'd love to hear more about your journey and how you got here.
Well, there are still persistent barriers to rise up through the ranks. Now, it's changed over the last generation, several generations. It's changed from policies of women may not hold these jobs to hostility to, implicit biases. But it is true that the numbers of women drop out as you go up the pipeline. And I think a lot of that is because people use the leaky pipeline analogy, but I don't think that's the right analogy. Really? Talking about a pipeline that leaks suggests that every drop of water has an equal chance, and it's some sort of coincidental event whether the drop falls out the hole in the pipe or not. I think it's sticky filters. I think to reach from one level to another, you have to hit certain levels of expectation. And if at every step of the way you're expected to take a back seat, or you're burdened with more unpaid work, or you're expected to do more of the laboratory cleanup, or your letter of recommendation has more words like very nice instead of spearheaded the project, it's harder and harder to reach those upper levels. And without equal numbers of the genders and the races and the backgrounds and ways of thought around the table, constricted decisions get made.
So how did you come to where you are? Was it in spite of or because of the structure?
A couple of things. Real persistence. I have felt throughout my career that I needed to be 30 to 40% better than a man to be viewed as equivalent. And so my way forward was to be okay. I will work harder. I will be better. And I, in order to fight implicit biases of, well, you must be less experienced than this person, you must be 10 years younger than this person, you just have to put the facts, the paper, and the CV in front of people. And you have to take an intentional look at things. And the other way is I've used the skills I have. As work is increasingly collaborative, as scientific research is less of the model of a single person working by themselves in a laboratory late at night and more of a collaborative model with multiple disciplines, you need to be able to work with people. You need to be able to communicate. You need to be able to organize. You need to be trustworthy. And all of those skills of building trust and uniting people and communicating, those are stereotypically feminine skills. Now, there are men that are extraordinary in all of these things, and there are women that are terrible in all of these things.
Sure.
But often it is that if females can, think with both halves of their brain and build more empathy, they can unite and inspire a research team, or they can communicate the why of why a study needs to be done. And if those were the skills I had, then that was what I was going to use.
That's beautifully said, and I assume that that's the leadership style you bring to the Institute.
It's very much collaborative. There's a lot of research now. I've spent the last couple of years in business school too. There's a lot of management research on what is it that inspires a high performance workplace. The command and control model may have worked in the military or in, back in the Industrial Revolution, where people coming off the farms were doing unskilled work in an assembly line and then barking orders and telling them to work faster, got more widgets made. But in a modern workplace where you're working with ideas and you need creativity and you're working with teams, command and control simply doesn't work. You need something that's more agile. You need something that allows creation of ideas and fostering of ideas, and the ideas bubble up. So you have to be collaborative. You have to want and invite voices and participation.
You and I had a quick conversation right after the Dobbs decision, and I was really looking at kind of the broad implications of that effect on so many, parts of our society, not just health and healthcare. And I specifically asked you, was there any impact that you saw on research? So would you mind sharing what you responded?
The reversal of Roe v. Wade.
Yes.
Yeah. I think the biggest effect is going to be on the researchers themselves. There's a tremendous cost of pregnancy and childbearing to your ability to work and your ability to choose what children you have and when, and your earning power and your education. And if the ability of a woman to pursue and complete her education, or to pursue her research, or to choose when she has children and who will be that father and help her rear them to adulthood, if that's gone, it's a tremendous threat to half our workforce. It's a threat to more than half the workforce, because you will have young men that are fathers to children they didn't intend to have, and they will have child support they may not have intended to pick up.
I remember you saying that to me, and it was very impactful. Well, let's shift gears a little bit, and, let's go back to COVID for just a moment, because I want to talk about the or vaccines. And you talked about the disease, talked about long COVID, and any differences in the response to either the COVID vaccine versus any of the vaccines in general.
So this is an interesting area, and COVID's been quite an interesting test case, because millions of people were all naive to the same virus at the same time and all got the same virus at the same time. So from a data perspective, it let us learn things about viral immunology in a scale that wasn't previously possible. So let's say you wanted to study influenza. Well, we've all been exposed to influenza of different kinds, different points in our life, but this is something we were all naive to, and it's something where we had millions of people get the same vaccine at the same time. So you could actually do the large studies. Whether males and females have different responses to vaccines is a topic that needs a lot more research. There are some studies that say that females have a stronger immune response to the same dose of vaccine than does a male. There are some studies that say there are no differences. And so it may depend on the type of vaccine. It may depend on the prior exposure history. Some vaccines are having on top of a previous exposure. Some vaccines are having for your first time. It also depends on whether this is a pediatric vaccine where you don't have the same levels of hormonal difference versus an adult vaccine. It's something that needs a lot more research. There are some studies that say that if females have a stronger immune response than males to a certain vaccine, maybe we should modulate the vaccine formula or modulate the dosage. We certainly don't sell the same kinds of blue jeans to men and women. Maybe we should start to think about whether a therapy aimed at an entirely different immune system should come in two different types. It's an intriguing possibility to do personalized medicine, but in a less complex way.
Sure. My head is swimming by thinking about all the variables that you have to take into account. And I would think that maybe it's a lot of fun in some ways, but also to me, it's almost overwhelming. One area that I think we touched on but really didn't talk about is, what about the variable of race or ethnicity? How does that get factored in?
It's an important underlying difference, right? Your genetic differences influence what different flavors of each protein you encode. Your exposure history influences things, the environment in which you grew up, your socioeconomic status, the foods you eat. There are studies that say that some races are more susceptible to some diseases than others. And that's a source of information we can use to figure out how to treat everybody better.
I wanted to talk a little bit about WHAM, because you have this new affiliation, and that's Women's Health Access Matters.
WHAM is a valued partner with ours. So WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters, was a group of really concerned women that said there's an economic cost here to the failure to adequately study and fund women's health research. Let's figure out what it is. And so WHAM commissioned the RAND Corporation to do a data-driven study on what is the cost to the American economy of low levels of funding. And they picked 3 representative diseases: heart disease, #1 killer of women, rheumatoid arthritis, and Alzheimer's. Women are more predisposed to Alzheimer's, and it's not just because we live longer. There's a biological difference. We have greater levels of neurofibrillary tangles and so on.
And is that an inflammatory response in your?
We are thinking so. There's definitely a role for the immune system, and sometimes the immune markers, at least for Parkinson's, an interesting and neurological disease with a male predominance, the immune activity predates some of the onset of symptoms. So we need to understand if it's correlative or is it trying to clear it. So WHAM commissioned RAND to just put some numbers and research behind it. And they said, okay, of all the research being done on heart disease, on rheumatoid arthritis, on Alzheimer's disease, what percentage is focused on women? And really conservative modeling of, if we increased this investment a little bit. So let's say, they may say, let's double the amount of research done on women. So if there's $90 million of federal research in rheumatoid arthritis every year, $6 million of that is focused on women. If we make that $12 million, so we're talking about a $6 million out of a $90 million total, what would be the end result on disability adjusted life years? What is the end result on the economy, on these women in the prime of their life being able to work, being able to care for people and also the role of, in their study, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, women are more often to be the caretakers of Alzheimer's patients. And so you're less able to, work and earn money. And what they found, the numbers are really staggering. There's a 174,000% return on investment to the American economy of increased funding in women's health. And the numbers they used were really modest. Spend $1, the economy boosts $1,740. And what they were looking at is, let's say we just add, another 6 million out of 90 in this direction. And let's say it improves health of women by something modest like 1%. Over the number of women and the number of years, it's a staggering improvement in the American economic health. It's an investment that we can't afford not to make.
Exactly. And I talk a lot about policy and politics impacting on women's health, and I think this is a really good example, because it's policy that determines those budgets and politicians who determine those policies. I know it got the attention of a number of folks on Capitol Hill. Is there any legislation that we might see that might be impacted by that?
Yes, actually, the Defense Appropriations Committee put some language into their bill for the House saying in the health research that the Department of Defense funds, we need to consider health of women. And the DoD is a major supporter of health research, research into breast cancer that it supports everybody. There's actually language in the House bill, and it's really important right now for people on the House and people on the Senate to realize the economic improvement in the American economy from a small boost of research. And when the bill for the House and the bill of the Senate merge together, it's important that that language remain in there.
And so I can't underline enough the importance of these next midterm elections and voting. What did I not ask that you feel is important to this audience?
I think the major thing is awareness. If people it had not occurred to them that there are different immune responses in males and females. And that leads to a very different manifestation of heart disease. For males, it's the quintessential clutching of the chest in the pain. For females, it's not a blockage of major artery. It's a blockage of microvasculature, tiny little vessels. And so it's not the clutching of the chest. It's like fatigue or dizziness. And people have thought of heart disease as a man's disease. And so men, I think, are more likely to prescribe things like statins or, things that we have. Women tend to be prescribed these less often or differently. And so women
or anti-anxiety medications.
Exactly. It's misdiagnosed with the impression that there's something wrong with the woman, not with the biological health thing. There's something wrong with her head. And so it means that women are 50% more likely to die within a year of a heart attack. And so the cost to society of having these blinders to the very real differences that your biological sex makes to your immune function are tremendous. And we need to understand that. That's information that we can use to improve the health of both sexes. The molecule that that was only found in females that didn't progress to heart disease, that was not found in males at all. Look at that molecule. Is that a supplement for men too? Can it protect men from heart disease? That would be great. Does it tell you a pathway? Does it tell you what to research? Does it point you to something else? It's a wellspring of information that nobody had thought to look at before, but it's a place that our institute is going.
And before I let you go, what is one action, we like to leave people with something that they can do that you would suggest from your experience that they can take to be more healthy?
Focus on sleep. Get enough sleep.
And can I tell you, everybody says that. Is that the funniest thing?
Write to your congressperson. Because
about your sleep?
No. Write to your congressperson about the importance of women's health and research in women's health. Because we study what there is money to study. If there's no money to do the work does not get done. We researchers completely rely on federal grants to do any of this research. And what Congress decides should be done is what there is money available to do. If Congress people don't understand the importance of women's health to the nation's economy, they may inadvertently redline out that language. It's important that Congress understands, and that's one representative and one senator at a time, and not just the females. The male representatives and the male senators need to understand it too.
I will give you another amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Erica Ullman Sapphire, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure to join you.
There was so much here that I'd like to call your attention to. First, the science that is being uncovered to help explain the biological differences between men and women and the way we experience disease is happening right now. As I said in the beginning, the differences are not just due to hormones, but it's also our genes. Scientists are studying the effect of those hormones on sex-linked genes in turning our immune system on and off. The effect of sex differences on diseases such as infections, cancer, heart disease, and autoimmune disease could potentially affect the different ways disease might be diagnosed and treated in women and men. It's exciting that these questions are being considered and explored, but perhaps this could have happened much earlier if we had included women and female animals in research, and we might have been further along in having the answers we need to improve women's health. And it's probably not coincidence that the growing numbers of women in science coincides with the increased awareness of the importance of including women and other underrepresented people in clinical studies. There are still barriers to women's progress in science, but when they do achieve leadership positions, they bring skills that enhance collaboration and creativity, which are key aspects of scientific discovery. And finally, I echo Dr. Sapphire's call to action. Congress determines the budget that will fund research, including what kind of research gets done. We have an upcoming election on November the 8th, so this is an opportune time to bring the subject up with candidates and after the election with elected representatives. And I invite you to our webinar, Putting Women's Health on the Ballot. It's on October 26th. You'll hear about the issues and specific ways you can make an impact on the policies that affect women's health and well-being. You can find more information and register at beyondthepapergown.com. And even if you can't make it on the 26th, do register and we'll send you a link to the recording. As always, thank you for listening and don't forget to vote. Our podcast is produced by Patrick Shambayati and me, and our associate producer is Kyla McMillian. Until next time, be well.